The private jet touched down at the small airport just outside Greenwich, Connecticut, at 9:30 in the evening. David Chen stepped out into the cool autumn air, loosening his tie with one hand while scrolling through his phone with the other. The business meeting in Singapore had wrapped up 2 days earlier than expected, which meant he could finally get some rest in his own bed instead of another hotel room. His driver pulled up in the black sedan, and within 20 minutes they were rolling through the iron gates of his estate. David had worked for 15 years to build his software company from a cramped studio apartment into a billion-dollar enterprise. This house, sitting on 12 acres of perfectly manicured land, was supposed to be his reward, his sanctuary. Yet somehow he spent more time in airports and conference rooms than he did enjoying any of it. The house was dark except for a few security lights along the driveway. David thanked his driver and walked toward the front door, rolling his small suitcase behind him. He punched in the security code and stepped inside. The silence hit him immediately. Usually, even late at night, there would be some sign of life. His housekeeper, Rose Martinez, lived in a small cottage at the back of the property. She typically left a light on in the kitchen and a note on the counter about any messages or deliveries. Tonight, there was nothing. David walked through the marble foyer into the kitchen. No note, no light. He checked his watch again. Rose had been with him for 3 years now, and she ran his household like clockwork. Every morning at 6, she'd start coffee. By 7, she'd have breakfast ready. She managed his dry cleaning, his grocery deliveries, even reminded him about his mother's birthday. She was quiet, efficient, and the most trustworthy person he'd ever employed. He pulled out his phone and called her number. It rang 6 times before going to voicemail. That was odd. Rose always answered, even late at night. One time, he'd called her at 2 in the morning because he couldn't figure out how to turn off a beeping smoke detector, and she'd answered on the second ring. David walked upstairs to his bedroom thinking maybe he was overthinking things. Perhaps Rose had gone to visit family and forgot to mention it. He'd been traveling so much lately that he might have missed an email or message. He kicked off his shoes and was about to change clothes when his phone buzzed. It was a text from his head of security, Vincent. "Sir, we have a situation. Please check your email immediately." David's stomach tightened. He opened his laptop and found an email from Vincent sent 4 hours earlier. The subject line read, "Security alert, property breach." His heart started pounding as he clicked it open. There was a video attachment. David pressed play and watched his security footage from the previous night. The timestamp showed 3:17 a.m. The camera angle showed his 4-car garage from the side entrance. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the side door opened and a figure stepped out. It was Rose. David leaned closer to the screen. Rose looked around nervously, checking over her shoulders several times. She was wearing jeans and a dark hoodie, not her usual work clothes. She propped the door open and disappeared back inside the garage. A minute later, she emerged again, this time walking backward, pulling something heavy. David's blood ran cold. She was wheeling out his motorcycle. Not just any motorcycle. His father's 1969 Triumph Bonneville, the vintage bike that his dad had restored by hand over 3 years, working every weekend in their old garage in Sacramento. The bike his father had taught him to ride on, the summer before the heart attack that killed him at age 52. David was 16 then. He'd kept that motorcycle in climate-controlled storage for 20 years, barely riding it, unable to part with it. It wasn't just worth $85,000. It was priceless. In the video, Rose struggled with the heavy bike, walking it slowly down the driveway. She didn't start the engine. She just pushed it step by step until she disappeared beyond the camera's range toward the front gate. David sat frozen, staring at the screen. This didn't make sense. Rose knew what that motorcycle meant to him. He'd told her the story once, maybe a year ago, when she'd asked about the covered bike in the garage. He'd even shown her the photos of him and his dad working on it together. She'd seemed genuinely touched by the story. Why would she take it? He scrolled through more emails from Vincent. His security team had caught it on multiple cameras. Rose had somehow disabled the motion sensors on the garage and the main gate. She must have been planning this. The bike's GPS tracker showed it had moved across state lines into New Jersey before the signal was disabled around 4:30 a.m. Vincent's email ended with a question. "Do you want me to file a police report and alert the authorities?" We have clear evidence and can likely recover the bike within 24 hours. David's finger hovered over the reply button. Every logical part of his brain screamed at him to say yes. This was theft, clear premeditated theft. The police should be involved. Insurance should be notified. Rose should be arrested, but something stopped him. He thought about the past 3 years. Rose had keys to everything. His cars, his safe, his home office where he kept important documents. She knew his schedule, his bank delivery days, everything. If she wanted to rob him, she could have done it 100 different ways and disappeared with much more than a motorcycle. She'd always been honest to a fault. Once, a dinner guest had left a $200 tip on the table, and Rose had chased them down the driveway to return it, insisting she couldn't accept it. Another time, she'd found a $50 bill in the laundry and spent an hour trying to figure out which pair of pants it had fallen from, so she could put it back in the right pocket. This woman wouldn't steal without a reason, a desperate reason. David closed his laptop and paced his bedroom. His security team was waiting for instructions. His insurance company would need to be called. The police would want statements. But David couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. He grabbed his phone and opened the GPS tracking app linked to all his vehicles. The motorcycle's last known location was in Newark, New Jersey, in a neighborhood called Ironbound. The signal had cut out at 4:33 a.m., which meant Rose had found the tracker and disabled it. She was smart enough to know it was there. David made a decision that his lawyers would probably call stupid. Instead of calling the police, he forwarded the GPS coordinates to his personal phone. Then he texted Vincent, "Hold off on the police report. I'm handling this personally. I'll be in touch." 3 dots appeared immediately as Vincent typed back, "Sir, with respect, I strongly advise against..." David didn't wait for him to finish. He grabbed his car keys, pulled on a jacket, and headed back downstairs. If Rose had stolen from him, he wanted to hear why from her own mouth before he destroyed her life with criminal charges. And if there was some explanation, some emergency he didn't know about, he needed to understand it. The last place the GPS had pinged was 43 miles away. David got in his car and started driving into the night, following the coordinates to a neighborhood he'd never been to, looking for answers to questions he didn't even know how to ask yet. The GPS coordinates led David deeper into Newark than he'd ever been before. His luxury sedan felt completely out of place as he drove through streets lined with old brick buildings and corner stores, with metal gates pulled down for the night. This wasn't the dangerous neighborhood that news reports sometimes painted. It was just working class, tired and honest, the kind of place where people worked 2 jobs to make ends meet. David's phone guided him through narrow streets until the pin on his map indicated he'd arrived at the location. He pulled over and looked around. The motorcycle wasn't here. Of course it wasn't. The GPS had been disabled hours ago, but this was the last place it had pinged, which meant Rose had been here. This had to mean something. He parked his car and got out, looking at the buildings around him. There was a bodega on the corner, lights still on. Across the street stood a 3-story apartment building with laundry hanging from fire escapes. And next to that, a community center with faded paint and a hand-painted sign that read, "Ironbound Youth Center, building tomorrow's leaders today." Something made David walk toward the community center. Maybe it was intuition. Maybe it was just the only building that looked like it might have security cameras. As he got closer, he noticed something covered with a blue tarp in the narrow alley beside the building. His pulse quickened. He walked over and lifted the corner of the tarp. Even in the dim streetlight, he recognized the chrome and the distinctive shape. His father's Triumph Bonneville. It was really here, covered hastily, like someone had tried to hide it quickly but didn't have time to do it properly. David stood there for a long moment, his hand still holding the tarp. He could call Vincent right now. The bike was here. The police could come, retrieve it, and track down Rose. Case closed. But he didn't reach for his phone. Instead, he covered the bike back up and walked to his car. He parked it down the street where it was less obvious and settled in to wait. He didn't have to wait long. At just past 11, a figure emerged from the community center. Even from a distance, David recognized Rose's walk, the way she carried herself. She looked exhausted, like she'd been away. For days. She stopped at the motorcycle, checked that it was still covered, then looked around nervously. She pulled out her phone, made a call, and paced back and forth. David could see her wiping her eyes. A few minutes later, a young man in his early 20s walked up. He hugged Rose and they talked for a few minutes. The young man gestured at the motorcycle, then at his watch. Rose shook her head, clearly upset. They talked some more, and then the young man helped Rose push the heavy bike further into the alley, hiding it better behind a dumpster. David watched as they said goodbye. The young man walked off in one direction, and Rose headed the opposite way toward the apartment building David had noticed earlier. She climbed the front steps and disappeared inside. David sat in his car, mind racing. Rose lived here. This was her real home, not the cottage on his property. Why had he never known that? Why had he never asked? In 3 years of employment, he'd never once asked Rose about her family, her life, where she came from when she wasn't making his coffee or folding his laundry. The realization made him uncomfortable. He decided to follow her, at least to understand more. But instead of confronting her, he wanted to see what she was doing. What could be so desperate that it would drive someone like Rose to steal? He waited 15 minutes, then got out of his car and walked toward the bodega on the corner. The older man behind the counter looked up from his newspaper as David entered. The store was cramped but clean, selling everything from bread to cleaning supplies. "Evening," David said, trying to sound casual. "I'm looking for someone. A woman named Rose Martinez. I think she lives around here." The man studied David for a moment, taking in his expensive jacket and watch. "Who's asking?" "A friend," David lied. "I need to get a message to her. It's important." The man's expression didn't change. "Building next door. 3rd floor. But if you're really her friend, you'd know she's dealing with enough right now without more trouble." David felt the words like a slap. "What kind of trouble?" The man shook his head. "Not my business to tell. You want to buy something or not?" David grabbed a bottle of water and paid, then left. He stood on the sidewalk looking up at the apartment building. Lights were on in several windows on the 3rd floor. He couldn't just knock on doors randomly. And what would he say if he found her? "Why did you steal my motorcycle?" It sounded ridiculous even in his head. Instead, David walked back to the community center. The front door was locked, but there were lights on inside. He knocked, hoping someone might still be there. After a moment, the same young man who'd helped Rose appeared at the door. He opened it a crack. "We're closed," he said. "I'm sorry to bother you," David said quickly. "I'm looking for information about Rose Martinez. I saw her here earlier." I'm her employer." The young man's expression hardened instantly. "You're the guy from Connecticut," David blinked. "How did you—" "She talks about you sometimes. About the big house and the fancy cars." The young man didn't make it sound like a compliment. "What do you want?" "I need to find her. Something happened and I need to talk to her." "About the bike," the young man said flatly. David's silence confirmed it. The young man stepped outside and closed the door behind him. He was tall, with tired eyes that looked older than his years. "Let me guess. You tracked it here. You want it back. You're going to press charges." "I don't know what I'm going to do," David said honestly. "That's why I'm here. I need to understand why she took it." "You really don't know?" The young man laughed bitterly. "You live in that mansion, and you don't know what's happening in the life of the woman who makes your bed every morning?" David felt his face flush. "Then tell me." The young man studied him for a long moment. "It's not my story to tell, but I'll say this. Rose is the most honest person I know. She volunteers here 3 nights a week teaching English to immigrants. She's never taken a handout in her life. If she took something from you, she's desperate. And I mean life or death desperate. Life or death," David repeated. "That's all I'm saying. You want answers? Go talk to her yourself. 3rd floor, apartment 3C. But if you're just here to make her life worse, do everyone a favor and leave." The young man went back inside and locked the door. David stood alone on the sidewalk. Life or death. The words echoed in his mind. He walked back to the apartment building and climbed the 3 flights of stairs. The hallway smelled like cooking spices and old carpet. He found apartment 3C and raised his hand to knock. Then he heard crying from inside. Not just crying, sobbing. Deep, soul-breaking sobs that made David freeze with his fist in the air. He heard Rose's voice, thick with tears. "I know, baby. I know it hurts. The doctor said they're doing everything they can. Just hold on. Please just hold on a little longer." There was a pause, then a younger voice, weak and strained. "Mom, I'm scared." "I know, sweetie. I know, but Mama's going to fix this. I promise you." "I'm going to fix this." David lowered his hand slowly. He backed away from the door, his heart hammering in his chest. Rose had a child. A sick child by the sound of it. And she'd stolen his motorcycle. The pieces started connecting in David's mind, but he needed to know for sure. He couldn't just guess. He walked back down the stairs and returned to his car. He sat there for nearly an hour, watching the building, trying to decide what to do. Finally, around 1 in the morning, Rose emerged again. She was carrying 2 plastic bags and walking quickly. David got out of his car and followed her at a distance. She walked 4 blocks to an all-night pharmacy. Through the window, David watched her at the counter talking to the pharmacist. Even from outside, he could see the desperation in her body language. The pharmacist shook his head. Rose pulled out her wallet, counted money, then said something else. The pharmacist shook his head again. Rose's shoulders slumped. She left the pharmacy empty-handed, wiping her eyes as she walked. David made a split-second decision. He jogged to catch up with her. "Rose." She spun around and her face went white. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Rose's face crumpled and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "Mr. Chen," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." "I'm so sorry." Rose stood on the sidewalk under the fluorescent glow of the pharmacy sign, tears streaming down her face. She looked smaller somehow, like all the strength had drained out of her. Her hands were shaking, and she couldn't seem to meet David's eyes. "I was going to tell you," she said, her voice breaking. "I wrote a letter. It's in my room at your house. I was going to leave it where you'd find it. I was going to turn myself in after—" She couldn't finish the sentence. David's anger had evaporated the moment he'd heard her crying through that apartment door. Now he just felt confused and concerned. "After what, Rose? What's going on?" She shook her head, backing away slightly. "It doesn't matter now. You found me. You found the bike. I know you're going to call the police, and you should. I'm a thief. I stole from you. But please, just give me 2 more days. That's all I need. 2 days, and then I'll accept whatever happens to me." 2 days for what? David pressed gently. Rose's legs seemed to give out. She sat down hard on the curb, her face in her hands. David hesitated, then sat down beside her. They must have looked strange. A billionaire in an expensive jacket and his housekeeper sitting on a dirty curb outside a pharmacy at 1 in the morning. "My son," Rose finally said. "His name is Miguel. He's 14 years old." David waited, not pushing her. 3 days ago, he collapsed at school. During gym class. They rushed him to the hospital. Rose's voice was flat now, like she'd cried all the emotion out. "The doctor said his heart is failing. He has a condition called dilated cardiomyopathy. His heart is too weak to pump blood properly. He needs surgery. Emergency surgery. They said if he doesn't get it within the next 72 hours, she didn't need to finish." David felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. "The surgery cost $250,000, Rose continued. "Our insurance denied the claim. They said Miguel had a pre-existing condition that we didn't disclose when we signed up. But we didn't know. We had no idea anything was wrong until he collapsed. I've been fighting with them for 3 days, but they won't budge. I called every charity, every foundation, every program I could find. I started a crowdfunding page. We raised $18,000. 18,000, David's mind was racing. $250,000. To him, that was nothing. Less than nothing. He spent more than that on art he never looked at. But to Rose, it might as well have been $1 billion. "I thought about taking a loan," Rose said, "but no bank would give me that much. I don't own anything. I don't have collateral. My credit is okay, but not great. I asked everyone I know, everyone in my family. My brother sent $500. My cousin sent $200. It wasn't enough. It's never enough." She looked at David then, her eyes red and swollen. "I wasn't going to steal your motorcycle to keep it. I found a collector online who buys vintage bikes. He offered me $80,000 cash, no questions asked. I was supposed to meet him tomorrow morning. $80,000 isn't enough for the surgery. But the hospital said if I could pay that much up front, they'd do the surgery and work out a payment plan for the rest. They said they'd let me pay it off over 10 years, 20 years, whatever it took." David felt something twist in his chest. His father's motorcycle, the last piece he had of his dad. Rose was going to sell it to save her son's life. I know it was wrong, Rose said quickly. I know there's no excuse for stealing. I couldn't let my baby die. I couldn't just sit there and watch him get weaker every day knowing I could do something. Even if it meant going to jail. Even if it meant losing everything. At least he'd be alive. David sat in silence for a long moment. He thought about his own father, about that last summer they'd spent together working on the motorcycle. He remembered his dad's hands stained with grease, patiently teaching him how to adjust the carburetor. He remembered the heart attack, how sudden it was, how his 16-year-old self had felt so helpless, so powerless to save the man who'd meant everything to him. Where is Miguel now? David asked quietly. Rose seemed surprised by the question. At Newark University Hospital. He's in the cardiac ICU. They're keeping him stable with medications, but the doctors said the medications will only work for so long. His heart is getting weaker. Can I see him? Rose stared at David like he'd spoken a foreign language. What? Your son? Can I meet him? I don't understand. Why would you want to? David stood up and offered Rose his hand. Because I need to understand what I'm dealing with here. And because I need to see him before I make any decisions. Rose took his hand hesitantly, letting him pull her to her feet. Mr. Chen, I don't expect you to forgive me. I know what I did was wrong. I'll give you back the motorcycle right now. It's in the alley by the community center. I didn't damage it, I promise. And I'll accept whatever consequences come. Just please, if you're going to call the police, can you wait until after I see Miguel one more time? I'm not calling the police, David said. Not yet anyway. First, I want to meet your son. Is the hospital far? It's a 15-minute drive, but visiting hours are over. They won't let anyone in except immediate family. Let me worry about that, David said. My car's down the street. Rose looked uncertain, but she followed him. They walked in silence to where his sedan was parked. Rose stopped when she saw it, that same look of discomfort crossing her face that David had noticed earlier when she'd seen his house, his cars, all his things. The distance between their worlds. The drive to the hospital was quiet. Rose sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, occasionally giving directions. David could see her reflection in the window, the worry etched into every line of her face. When they arrived at the hospital, David parked in the emergency lot and they walked to the main entrance. A security guard stopped them at the desk. Visiting hours ended at 9, he said. David pulled out his wallet and handed the guard his business card. My name is David Chen. I'm the CEO of Chen Technologies. I need to visit a patient in the cardiac ICU. It's urgent. The guard looked at the card, then at David, then at Rose. Are you family? I'm his mother, Rose said. The guard picked up a phone and made a call. After a brief conversation, he nodded. The charge nurse says you can go up, Mrs. Martinez, but only immediate family. He's with me, Rose said firmly. He's helping with the medical bills. The guard hesitated, then waved them through. They took the elevator to the 4th floor. The cardiac ICU was quiet, all dim lights and beeping machines. A nurse at the station recognized Rose and gave her a sympathetic smile. He's been asking for you, the nurse said. He's awake but tired. Try not to stay too long. He needs rest. Rose led David down a corridor to a room at the end. She paused at the door, her hand on the handle. He's a good kid, she whispered. Honor roll student. He wants to be a doctor someday. He volunteers at the community center teaching younger kids how to code. He's never been in trouble. He's just a good kid who got dealt a bad hand. She opened the door. The boy in the bed looked small against the white sheets. He had Rose's eyes and her smile, though it was weak now. Tubes and wires connected him to various machines. His skin had an unhealthy pallor and David could see the exhaustion in his face. But when Miguel saw his mother, his whole face lit up. Mom, he said, his voice hoarse, I thought you went home to sleep. I can't sleep when you're here, baby. Rose walked to his bedside and kissed his forehead. How are you feeling? Tired, but okay. Miguel's eyes shifted to David, curious. Who's this? Rose hesitated. David stepped forward. My name is David. I'm a friend of your mom's. Miguel smiled weakly. Any friend of my mom's must be pretty special. She doesn't make friends easy. She says she doesn't have time. He tried to laugh but ended up coughing. Rose quickly gave him some water through a straw. David pulled up a chair and sat down. He didn't know what he'd expected, but this kid seemed so normal. so hopeful despite everything. Your mom tells me you want to be a doctor, David said. Miguel's eyes brightened a little. Yeah, a cardiologist, actually. Funny, right? I want to fix hearts and mine's the one that's broken. He said it without self-pity, just matter of fact. What made you want to be a doctor? My mom, Miguel said simply. She works so hard taking care of everyone else. I wanted to do something that helps people like her. People who can't afford to get sick but get sick anyway. David glanced at Rose. She was crying silently, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. They talked for a few more minutes. Miguel told David about his coding classes at the community center, about the website he was building for a local church, about his dream of going to medical school. The boy's spirit was unbreakable, even while his body was failing. Finally, a nurse came in and said Miguel needed to rest. They said their goodbyes. Miguel hugged his mother tight. Don't worry, Mom, he whispered. Whatever happens, it's okay. You did everything you could. Those words seemed to break Rose completely. She held her son and sobbed. David and Rose walked out of the hospital in silence. The automatic doors slid shut behind them and Rose stopped on the sidewalk looking lost. The night air was cold and she wrapped her arms around herself. Thank you for not calling the police in there, she said quietly. And thank you for being kind to Miguel. You didn't have to do that. David didn't respond right away. His mind was spinning, replaying everything he'd just witnessed. That boy lying in a hospital bed, talking about his dreams while his heart was slowly giving out. Rose standing beside her son, trying to be strong when her whole world was falling apart. And him, David Chen, who could fix this entire problem with a single phone call but had been completely unaware it was even happening. How long have you been dealing with this alone? David asked. Rose looked down at her feet. 3 days since he collapsed. But the signs were there before. He was getting tired easily. Sometimes he'd get dizzy. I thought it was just stress from school. He's taking advanced classes, studying for the SATs. I thought he was just working too hard. Her voice cracked. I should have known. I should have taken him to a doctor sooner. You couldn't have known, David said. Stop blaming yourself. That's what the doctors keep saying. But he's my son. I'm supposed to protect him. I'm supposed to keep him safe. And instead I'm stealing motorcycles in the middle of the night like some criminal. David looked at her standing there. This woman who cleaned his house and made his meals and had worked for him for 3 years. He realized he'd never really seen her before. Not as a real person with a real life. She'd just been part of the background like his furniture or his artwork. Present but not noticed. Get in the car, David said. Rose looked up at him, confused. What? Get in the car. We need to go somewhere. Mr. Chen, I should get back to Miguel. What if something happens? The nurses have your number. They'll call if anything changes. This won't take long. Trust me, Rose hesitated, then nodded. They got back in the car and David started driving. Rose kept asking where they were going, but David didn't answer. His mind was racing through possibilities, through solutions, through what needed to happen next. 20 minutes later, they pulled up in front of a modern glass building in downtown Newark. Most of the windows were dark, but a few lights were still on near the top floors. David parked in the underground garage and led Rose to a private elevator. Where are we? Rose asked as they rode up. My lawyer's office. Harold Brennan. He's the best attorney in the state and he keeps late hours. The elevator opened into a sleek reception area. A security guard sat at the desk, but he recognized David immediately. Mr. Chen, Mr. Brennan is expecting you. Rose gave David a startled look. You called him? While you were saying goodbye to Miguel, I texted him the situation. They walked down a hallway to a corner office. Harold Brennan was a man in his 60s with sharp eyes and gray hair. He stood up from behind his desk when they entered. David, and you must be Rose Martinez. He shook both their hands. I've been reviewing the insurance documents you forwarded me. Please sit down. David had sent him Rose's insurance denial letter from his phone while they were at the hospital. Harold spread several documents across his desk. This is outrageous, Harold said bluntly. Your insurance company is claiming your son had a pre-existing condition, but from what I can see, he was never diagnosed with anything before his collapse. They're denying coverage based on a technicality that doesn't hold water. Rose leaned forward. But they said because his condition might have been developing for months or years before symptoms showed, it counted as pre-existing. They said we should have disclosed it. How can you disclose something you don't know about? Harold shook his head. This is a common tactic insurance companies use to avoid paying large claims. They're betting you won't fight it because you can't afford a lengthy legal battle. I can't, Rose said, her voice small. I can barely afford the copays. That's where I come in, Harold said. I'm going to file an emergency appeal first thing in the morning. I've handled dozens of cases like this. We have a strong chance of getting this overturned. But the problem is timing. These appeals can take weeks or even months. Rose's face fell. Miguel doesn't have weeks. I know, Harold said gently, which is why we need a short-term solution for the immediate surgery, and the appeal will handle the long-term medical costs. Rose looked between Harold and David, not understanding. What do you mean? David took a deep breath. This was the moment he'd been wrestling with since he left Miguel's hospital room. He thought about his father's motorcycle sitting in that alley. He thought about his father, who had worked in a factory his whole life and still found ways to help neighbors in need. He thought about what his dad would do if he were here right now. Rose, I'm going to pay for Miguel's surgery, David said. The words hung in the air. Rose stared at him like he'd spoken in another language. What? She whispered. The full amount. $250,000. Plus whatever additional medical costs come up during recovery. I'll make the transfer to the hospital tonight so they can schedule the surgery for tomorrow morning. Rose's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Tears started streaming down her face. You don't have to do this, she finally managed to say. I stole from you. I deserve to be punished, not helped. You didn't steal from me, David said quietly. You borrowed something in a desperate moment, planning to use it to save your son's life. There's a difference, but the motorcycle. Your father's motorcycle. It means so much to you, David smiled sadly. My dad taught me a lot of things when I was working on that bike with him. He taught me about engines and tools and patience. But the most important thing he taught me was that possessions don't matter. People matter. He would have given away that motorcycle in a heartbeat if it meant saving a kid's life. Hell, he probably would have been angry with me for even hesitating. Rose was sobbing now, her whole body shaking. I don't know what to say. I can't ever repay you. I don't want you to repay me, David said. I want you to let me help. Not just with the surgery, but with everything. Harold is going to fight your insurance company and make sure they cover future medical costs. I'm going to set up a trust fund for Miguel's education. When he's ready for medical school, the money will be there. Why? Rose asked through her tears. Why would you do all this for us? You barely know us, David thought about that question. Why was he doing this? Part of it was guilt for being so blind to what was happening in the life of someone who worked for him every day. Part of it was thinking about his own father and what he would have wanted. But mostly it was because he'd looked into that hospital room and seen a good kid who deserved a chance at life, and a mother who loved her son enough to risk everything. Because I can, David said simply. Because I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. And what's the point of having it if I can't use it to help people when it really matters? Because Miguel wants to be a doctor to help people like you. Because you're one of the most honest people I've ever met. And you only broke that honesty to save your son's life. Because it's the right thing to do. Harold started preparing the paperwork. David made several phone calls, transferring money, speaking to hospital administrators, making things happen with the kind of speed that only money could buy. Within an hour, everything was arranged. The surgery was scheduled for 8 the next morning. The hospital had confirmed receipt of the payment. Rose sat in the chair, still crying, looking overwhelmed by everything happening so fast. There's one more thing, David said. I want you to take a leave of absence from work. Paid leave. Stay with Miguel while he recovers. Be there for him. Your job will be waiting when you're ready to come back. And Rose? She looked up at him. Stop thinking of yourself as my employee for a minute. You're a mother who loves her son. You did what any parent would do in your situation. You have nothing to be ashamed of. Rose stood up and hugged David. It was unexpected, and for a moment David froze. Then he hugged her back. She was crying into his shoulder, saying thank you over and over again. When they finally left Harold's office, the sun was starting to rise. They drove back to the hospital. Rose wanted to be there when Miguel woke up to tell him the good news. David walked her to the elevator. Go be with your son, he said. Tell him he's going to be okay. Rose hugged him one more time. I'll never forget this, never. You saved his life. David watched her disappear into the elevator. Then he walked back to his car and sat in the driver's seat for a long time, not starting the engine. He felt different somehow, lighter, like he'd been carrying weight he didn't know was there and now it was gone. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Vincent, his head of security, asking for an update on the motorcycle situation. David typed back a simple message. False alarm. Bike is secure. Situation resolved. Then he drove to the community center where his father's Triumph Bonneville was still hidden behind the dumpster. He looked at it for a long time, running his hand over the chrome. This bike had been his most prized possession. But now he understood it was never about the bike. It was about what the bike represented. The time with his father, the lessons learned, the love shared. And maybe the best way to honor his father's memory wasn't to keep the bike locked away in a garage, but to use what it could provide to give someone else the chance his father never got. A chance to live. The surgery took 7 hours. David hadn't planned to stay at the hospital, but somehow he found himself in the waiting room alongside Rose and her small family. Her brother had driven down from Boston. Her cousin had taken off work. A few people from the community center showed up with coffee and food. They all looked surprised to see David there, this wealthy stranger in expensive clothes sitting among them. But Rose had explained who he was and what he'd done. After that, they treated him like one of their own. Rose paced the waiting room floor, unable to sit still. Every time a doctor or nurse walked by, she'd look up hopefully, then slump back down when they passed without stopping. David watched her, understanding that fear in a way he hadn't before. When his own father had the heart attack, there'd been no waiting room, no surgery, just a phone call from the hospital saying it was over, that his dad was gone before they could do anything. Finally, a surgeon emerged through the double doors. She was still in her scrubs, pulling off her surgical cap. Rose jumped to her feet. "Mrs. Martinez?" the surgeon said with a tired smile. "The surgery went well. Miguel's heart is responding beautifully to the repairs. We replaced the damaged valve and strengthened the muscle tissue. He's in recovery now and his vitals are stable." Rose's legs buckled. Her brother caught her, holding her up as she cried with relief. The surgeon gave them details about recovery time, medications, follow-up appointments. David stood back, letting the family have their moment. But Rose reached out and grabbed his hand, pulling him into the circle. "This is David Chen," she told the surgeon, her voice thick with emotion. "He's the reason we're standing here right now. He's the reason my son is alive." The surgeon shook David's hand. "Then Miguel is very lucky to have you in his life." They let Rose see Miguel an hour later. David stayed in the waiting room, but Rose came back out and insisted he come too.
"He asked for you," she said.
"He wants to say thank you." Miguel was pale and groggy from the anesthesia, connected to even more machines than before. But his eyes were clear when they walked in and his smile was real. "Mr. Chen," he said, his voice weak. "Mom told me what you did. I don't really have words. Thank you doesn't seem like enough." David pulled a chair up beside the bed. "You don't need to thank me. Just focus on getting better. Mom said you paid for everything. The surgery, the medications, everything. And that you're helping with my college fund too." Miguel's eyes filled with tears. "Nobody's ever done anything like that for us before." "Well, now someone has," David said simply. "And when you become that cardiologist you want to be, you can pay it forward. Help other kids who need it." Miguel nodded, wincing slightly at the pain. "I will, I promise. I'm going to work harder than anyone. I'm going to make this worth it." "It's already worth it," David said. "You being alive is worth it." Over the next 2 weeks, David visited the hospital every day. He told himself it was just to check on Miguel's progress, but the truth was more complicated. He'd spent so much of his life focused on building his company, making money, acquiring things. Somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten what it felt like to connect with people, to be part of something that mattered beyond quarterly earnings and stock prices. Miguel recovered faster than the doctors expected. The kid was strong, determined. He had visitors constantly, friends from school, kids from the community center, teachers who brought homework so he wouldn't fall behind. The small hospital room was always full of life and laughter. David met so many people during those visits. He learned about the community center where Rose volunteered, about the programs they ran for kids in the neighborhood. He learned about the struggles these families faced, how many of them were one emergency away from financial disaster, just like Rose had been. It changed something in him. 3 weeks after the surgery, Miguel was discharged. David had arranged for a private medical transport to take him home, but Miguel insisted on walking out of the hospital on his own feet. Rose held one arm and David found himself holding the other, helping the boy who was still weak but getting stronger every day. The news crews were waiting outside. Somehow the story had leaked. A reporter shouted questions about the billionaire who paid for his maid's son's surgery. David tried to shield Rose and Miguel from the cameras, but Miguel stopped. "Let them ask," he said. "People should know what Mr. Chen did. Maybe it'll inspire others." So David stood there and answered questions. He talked about Rose's honesty and Miguel's dreams. He talked about his own father and the lessons he'd learned. He didn't mention the motorcycle or how all of this had started. That was Rose's private story to tell if she wanted. He just talked about the importance of helping others when you have the means to do so. The story went viral within hours. News outlets across the country picked it up. David's phone wouldn't stop ringing with interview requests, but he turned them all down. This wasn't about getting attention. It was about doing the right thing. But the attention brought something unexpected. Other people started reaching out. People with similar stories. Families struggling with medical bills they couldn't pay. Kids who needed help but had nowhere to turn. The requests poured in by the hundreds, then thousands. David sat in his home office one night reading through email after email. Each one was a story of struggle and hope, of people desperate for the kind of help he'd given Rose. He couldn't help them all. Nobody could. But he could do something. He called Harold, his lawyer. "I want to start a foundation," David said. "Something that helps families facing medical bankruptcy, especially kids who need emergency surgeries or treatments." "That's a big undertaking," Harold said. "Are you sure?" David thought about Miguel lying in that hospital bed talking about his dreams. He thought about Rose, willing to sacrifice everything to save her son. He thought about his father and the Triumph Bonneville that had started this whole chain of events. "I'm sure," David said. "Let's call it the Robert Chen Foundation after my dad." He would have liked that. 2 months later, the foundation was up and running. David had donated $50 million to start it, and other wealthy donors had matched his contribution. They'd helped 12 families in the first month alone. Kids who needed heart surgeries, cancer treatments, kidney transplants. Families who'd been drowning in medical debt suddenly had hope. Rose had taken the time off David offered, staying home with Miguel through his recovery. But she'd also started working with the foundation, helping screen applications and connect with families who needed help. She understood their struggles in a way David never could. She'd been there herself. Miguel went back to school with a scar on his chest and a new appreciation for life. His grades had always been good, but now they were exceptional. He volunteered more hours at the community center. He started a fundraising campaign to help other families afford medical care. The kid who'd almost died was now helping save others. 6 months after the surgery, David invited Rose and Miguel to his estate. Miguel had recovered fully, cleared by his doctors to return to all normal activities. David had something he wanted to show them. He led them to the garage where the Triumph Bonneville was parked, now fully serviced and gleaming. Miguel's eyes went wide. "Is that the motorcycle my mom borrowed?" he asked. "It is," David said. "And I've been thinking about what to do with it." Rose tensed. "Mr. Chen, you don't owe us anything more. You've already done so much." David shook his head. "This isn't about owing. This is about what my father would have wanted." He turned to Miguel. "My dad spent 3 years restoring this bike. He taught me everything I know about hard work and dedication while we worked on it together. It's one of the most valuable things I own, not because of its price, but because of what it represents." He pulled out a set of keys and held them out to Miguel. "When you turn 16 and get your license, this bike is yours." Miguel stared at the keys like they were made of gold. "Mr. Chen, I can't accept this. This belonged to your father, and now it belongs to someone who reminds me of him," David said. "Someone who works hard, who cares about others, who wants to make the world better. My dad would be happy knowing this bike went to someone like you." Rose was crying again, but this time they were different tears. Not tears of desperation or fear, but tears of gratitude and joy. Miguel took the keys with shaking hands. "I'll take care of it. I promise. I'll treat it like it's the most precious thing in the world." "I know you will," David said. They spent the afternoon together, David teaching Miguel about the motorcycle, showing him how to check the oil and adjust the mirrors just like his father had taught him. Rose watched from the garage doorway, smiling. Later, as they were leaving, Rose hugged David one more time. You gave me my son back, she whispered. You gave him a future. I'll spend the rest of my life grateful for that. You don't need to be grateful, David said. You just need to be happy. Both of you. After they left, David stood alone in his garage looking at the empty spot where the motorcycle had been. For the first time since his father died, that empty space didn't make him sad. Instead, it filled him with something else. Purpose. Connection. Hope. He'd spent 15 years building a fortune, thinking that success was measured in dollars and possessions. But Rose and Miguel had taught him something more valuable. Success wasn't about what you had. It was about what you did with it. It was about the lives you touched and the difference you made. His father's motorcycle would live on, carrying a new generation forward. And maybe that was the best ending the old Triumph Bonneville could have asked for, not sitting in a garage gathering dust, but out on the open road, reminding someone every day that they were loved, they were valued, and they were worth saving. David walked back to his house, but it didn't feel as empty as it used to. Tomorrow, he had a foundation meeting. 3 more families needed help. 3 more kids needed a chance at life. He smiled to himself. His father would have been proud, and for the first time in a long time, so was he.